The last vestiges of a fiery Wyoming sunset bled across the vast, bruised sky, painting the distant Laramie Mountains in hues of purple and deep orange. Against this magnificent, melancholic backdrop, a single, dusty silhouette emerged, framed perfectly by the fading light. It was a man, his form stoic and weathered, astride a powerful, equally weary horse. Each hoof beat kicked up a puff of ochre dust that lingered momentarily before dissolving into the thin, cool air. They moved with a deliberate, almost ritualistic pace, their destination clear despite the encroaching gloom, a cluster of dilapidated structures that barely clung to the horizon, a ghost ranch swallowed by time and neglect. This was it. This was home. Ethan Hale, the man in the saddle, felt the familiar ache in his bones, a dull throb that had nothing to do with the long miles he'd traveled and everything to do with the heavy burden of years. His face, a landscape of etched lines and sun-darkened skin, offered silent testimony to a life lived hard, often alone. Regret, a constant companion, clung to him like the fine dust coating his worn leather duster. He'd been away too long, a self-imposed exile that had stretched into decades. Driven by a youthful rebellion, he now struggled to recall with clarity, only the bitter taste of its consequences remaining. Now he was back, drawn by an invisible thread, a final, undeniable pull towards the land that had shaped him and the father he had left behind. His only confidant, Ghost, his sturdy Appaloosa, whinnied softly, a gentle presence whose rhythmic breathing was the only sound breaking the monumental silence. As they drew closer, the full scope of the ranch's decay became painfully evident. Fences, once sturdy sentinels, lay crumbled like forgotten bones. The barn, a grand structure from his childhood memories, now slumped, its roof a patchwork of holes, its sides warped and splintered. Weeds, thick and defiant, had reclaimed every inch of pathway and garden bed, an angry green tide engulfing what little remained of order. The main house, once the vibrant heart of the Hale homestead, stood silent and gaunt, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world that had moved on without it. It was a stark, brutal reflection of his own internal landscape, a place of abandonment, of erosion, where memories, once bright and sharp, had faded into a dull, persistent ache. Every broken board, every overgrown patch, every silent corner seemed to scream of what had been lost, of opportunities squandered, of words left unsaid. The sheer weight of it threatened to crush him, a suffocating blanket of decay that mirrored the neglect he'd shown not just the ranch, but himself. Ethan reined Ghost to a halt, the horse sensing the gravity of the moment, standing perfectly still. The last light had almost vanished, leaving the ranch shrouded in a deepening twilight. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the loose gravel that had replaced the once manicured path. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth, dying grass, and something else, a faint, cloying smell of dust and disuse, the smell of time passing. This wasn't just a physical homecoming, it was an emotional reckoning, a confrontation with a past he had tried so desperately to outrun. The ranch was a monument to his father's last stand, and now it was his. The overwhelming task ahead seemed insurmountable, yet a strange, stubborn flicker of resolve ignited deep within him. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and looked around, absorbing the profound silence. This journey back to his roots is just beginning. To follow Ethan's path of reckoning and rebuilding, make sure to subscribe now and join us as we uncover the secrets of the Hale Ranch. The first chill of the Wyoming night wrapped around Ethan as he dismounted, the familiar creak of the saddle a lonely counterpoint to the wind's low moan. His boot heels crunched on scattered gravel leading to the porch, each step echoing the years of absence. He began his solitary inventory of the ranch's decay, a silent, grim assessment of what had become of his father's life's work. The fences, once meticulously maintained, lay like broken skeletons across the fields, their barbed wire rusting into the earth. Posts leaned at drunken angles, some completely toppled, a testament to neglect and the relentless prairie winds. Beyond the immediate yard, the fields stretched, choked with an aggressive tapestry of weeds and wild grasses. What should have been neatly tilled rows or grazing pasture lay fallow, a stark symbol of abandonment. It was a mirror, he realized with a pang, to the barren landscape within himself, cultivated by years of avoidance and unresolved grief. This ranch's physical state was the primary antagonist, a monumental obstacle demanding immediate confrontation. It was not just broken wood and rusted metal, but the heavy weight of unaddressed history. The house itself stood like a ghost, its windows dark, reflecting only the fading twilight. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and time, a musty perfume of forgotten moments. He moved through the rooms, each one a stark reminder of a life lived, and then abruptly halted. Furniture, draped in white sheets like spectral figures, seemed to hold their breath. The kitchen, once the bustling heart of their home, was now a silent museum of forgotten meals and unspoken words. His father's worn armchair in the living room sat empty, a silent sentinel to a past Ethan had run from. Every surface was filmed with a fine layer of grit, the relentless march of nature reclaiming what was left untended. He started, almost subconsciously, with the porch. A broken railing post, splintered and rotting at its base, caught his eye. With a grunt, he tugged at it, testing its weakness. It came away with surprising ease, sending a shower of dried wood splinters to the floorboards. He picked up a rusty hammer lying forgotten on a nearby windowsill and began to pry loose a few more dangerously loose boards. The meager effort felt almost futile against the enormity of the task before him, like bailing out a sinking ship with a thimble. Yet, a nascent hope, a spark of obligation perhaps, flickered within him. It was a tangible act, a small victory against the encroaching tide of decay. He found an old, splintered broom by the back door, and though it barely held any bristles, he began to sweep the dust from the porch. Each swipe was an attempt to clear not just the physical grime, but the mental clutter that had accumulated over the years. The movement was repetitive, almost meditative, a small yet significant, physical engagement with the ranch he had abandoned. The sound of the broom scratching against the wood was the only noise, breaking the oppressive silence. He paused, wiping a sleeve across his brow, the taste of dust on his lips. The effort, though small, had begun. He was starting to chip away at the layers of neglect, not just of the ranch, but of himself. The enormity of the task was daunting, a mountain range of repairs and emotional reckonings stretched before him, but the first stone had been moved. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, casting long, dramatic shadows that seemed to swallow the dilapidated homestead whole. He stood there, a solitary figure against the deepening twilight, a man beginning the slow, arduous climb towards rebuilding. The initial days on the Hale Ranch stretched into an unnerving solitude, a silent expanse broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wind through skeletal trees and the soft, familiar snorts of his horse, Wrangler. Ethan moved through the dilapidated structures like a ghost, his boots scuffing dust motes that danced in the slivers of sunlight, piercing cracked windows. He spoke rarely, his voice an unfamiliar sound, even to himself, reserved for quiet commands to Wrangler or hushed frustrations aimed at a stubborn nail or a rotted beam. The ranch, once a vibrant hub of activity, felt like a mausoleum now, each creak and groan of the old house amplifying his isolation rather than diminishing it. Wrangler, ever present and patiently grazing nearby, became his sole confidant, a warm, breathing anchor in a sea of echoing memories. The horse's steady presence offered a subtle comfort, a silent understanding that transcended words, a bond forged through years of shared trails and quiet companionship. One afternoon, while sifting through a forgotten box in the study, a small leather-bound photo album slipped from his grasp. It landed with a soft thump, scattering a handful of loose pictures across the dusty floorboards. He knelt, his fingers trembling slightly as he gathered them. Amongst them, a faded, creased photograph caught his eye. It was a picture of him, perhaps 8 years old, perched precariously on a fence post, a wide, gap-toothed grin plastered across his face. Beside him, his father, younger then, but already etched with the lines of hard work, held a playful hand against his back, a rare, unguarded smile softening his stern features. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, not of joy, but of a specific, painful argument that followed shortly after that photo was taken. His father had insisted Ethan learn to rope, to break horses, to be a rancher, while young Ethan's dreams had soared far beyond these arid plains, towards cities and books and a life his father couldn't fathom. The image, once a testament to a fleeting moment of connection, now felt like a cruel memento of their divergent paths. A profound weariness settled over Ethan, heavier than any physical labor he'd undertaken since his return. He sank onto an old, moth-eaten armchair, the photograph still clutched in his hand. The question, an old, persistent wound, resurfaced. Why had he left? And more piercingly, why had he stayed away for so long? Guilt, a shadowy companion he'd tried to outrun for years, now pinned him to the chair. He'd convinced himself leaving was an act of self-preservation, a necessary escape from a life he hadn't chosen, from a father who seemed intent on molding him into a carbon copy of himself. But looking at the faded image, at the genuine, albeit brief, joy on his father's face, Ethan questioned the narrative he'd constructed. Had he simply been selfish? Had he valued his own nascent ambitions above his father's quiet love, above the unspoken plea for connection that he now, in hindsight, saw in every stern glance and every gruff instruction? The ranch, in its decaying state, seemed to whisper accusations, every creaking floorboard a testament to his absence, every broken window a symbol of a shattered relationship. He tried to rationalize it, to push the gnawing guilt back into the recesses of his mind. But the silence of the house, punctuated only by Wrangler's distant whicker, offered no escape. He was trapped, not by the physical walls of the ranch, but by the impenetrable barriers of his own conscience, wrestling with a past that demanded atonement. The oppressive weight of his introspection was abruptly shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a rhythmic thudding that was distinctly not Wrangler's. Ethan, still slumped in the armchair, startled, his hand instinctively going to his side as if reaching for a phantom revolver. He hadn't expected visitors, certainly not out here, far from the main road, and seemingly forgotten by time. He rose slowly, his muscles stiff, and moved towards the front door, peering cautiously through the dusty window pane. A man, older than Ethan remembered, sat astride a sturdy bay mare, his weathered face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. It was Old Man Hemlock, a neighbor from the adjacent spread, a man whose family had worked the land alongside the Hales for generations. Hemlock dismounted with a creak of leather and bone, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated ranch house, a silent assessment that made Ethan's cheeks flush. He opened the door, a faint squeal from the rusty hinges breaking the quiet. "Ethan." Hemlock's voice was gravelly, a sound etched by years of shouting at cattle and battling the elements. There was no warmth, no overt welcome, but also no malice, just a quiet recognition. "Heard you were back." Ethan nodded, a knot forming in his stomach. "Mr. Hemlock." He hadn't called him anything else since he was a boy. Hemlock's eyes, the color of a cloudy sky, fixed on Ethan. "Your pa." He held on long as he could. Ranch means a lot to a man, especially when it's all he's got left. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Ethan felt the familiar prickle of guilt, sharper now under the scrutiny of an outsider. Hemlock wasn't lecturing, not overtly, but his subtle tone carried the weight of years of observation, an intimate knowledge of the Hale family and their struggles. He was subtly hinting at the immense challenges Ethan's father had faced, alone, after his son's abrupt departure. The sheer effort of keeping the ranch afloat, battling solitude and the relentless decay, had slowly eroded his father, a battle Ethan had willfully chosen to ignore for far too long. "He struggled," Hemlock continued, his gaze drifting to the broken fence line that marked their shared boundary. "Wouldn't take help, not much anyway. Said he had to do it himself. For the boy, he'd say." He paused, then spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dry earth. Foolish pride, maybe, or just a father's stubborn love. Ethan flinched internally at the boy. He was a grown man, hardened by his own choices, yet in Hemlock's eyes, he was still the son who had abandoned his father. The phrase "stubborn love" resonated deeply, a painful echo of his own father's unyielding nature, a trait Ethan now recognized within himself. He wanted to retort, to explain, to defend his past actions, but the words caught in his throat. What defense could there be against the quiet suffering of a lonely old man? Hemlock finally turned, meeting Ethan's gaze directly. "You got a lot of work ahead of you, son. This place, it's seen better days. A lot better." He swung back onto his mare, the saddle creaking under his weight. "Water pump's been giving out on your north pasture for a while. Might want to look at that." And with that, he nudged his horse and rode off, leaving Ethan standing on the porch, the echoes of his words hanging in the stillness. The departure was as abrupt as his arrival, leaving Ethan with a fresh, raw wound of guilt, but also something else, a fleeting moment of shared humanity. Hemlock's brief visit, his cautious greeting, and his quiet observations had momentarily broken through Ethan's self-imposed isolation. It was a small crack in the wall Ethan had built around himself, a reminder that the world outside the ranch still existed, and that some connections, however strained, still remained. The mention of the water pump, a practical problem, also offered a concrete task, a small, tangible anchor in the swirling sea of his emotional turmoil. He stood there for a long time, watching the dust trail hemlock left behind, a strange mix of dread and a nascent, unfamiliar sense of obligation settling in his chest. The weight of his past convictions pressed heavily, a suffocating blanket woven from years of regret. Ethan finally pushed himself from the armchair, the crumpled photograph still in his hand, a stark reminder of what he had forsaken. He needed to move, to do something tangible, anything to escape the suffocating introspection the old house provoked. He sought the cool, crisp air outside, the vastness of the Wyoming sky a welcome balm compared to the cramped confines of memory. Wrangler met him at the porch, nudging his hand with a soft muzzle, a silent invitation to ride. It was a good idea. Action, not contemplation, was what he needed now. He saddled Wrangler, the familiar scent of leather and horse sweat, a comforting antidote to the musty odor of the house. They rode out towards the far pastures, an area he hadn't yet fully explored. The fences here were even worse, completely collapsed in places, offering no barrier against the encroaching prairie. As they crested a low hill, a sight both disheartening and strangely hopeful met his eyes. Scattered across the overgrown acreage, a small herd of cattle grazed listlessly. They were gaunt, their coats dull, clearly lacking proper care for months, perhaps even years. This wasn't the robust herd his father once prided himself on, but a shadow of its former glory, a tangible link to a dream left to wither. His father's brand, a jagged H with a distinctive crossbar, was faintly visible on their flanks. A pang of unexpected emotion shot through Ethan. These animals, against all odds, had survived. They were a testament to his father's enduring presence, a living, breathing extension of the man's labor and passion. He dismounted, approaching slowly, so as not to spook them. The cattle, skittish and wary, watched him with wide, nervous eyes. He counted 23 head, a meager number compared to the hundreds that once roamed these lands. One particular calf caught his attention. It lay separated from the others, tucked beneath a sparse sagebrush, its breathing shallow and labored. Its ribs were starkly visible beneath its thin hide, and its eyes held a vacant, faraway look. It was clear this calf was in dire straits, suffering from malnourishment and perhaps something more. He knelt beside it, his touch gentle as he assessed its condition. The calf barely reacted, too weak to struggle. A surge of immediate, urgent purpose coursed through him, pushing aside the lingering guilt and indecision. This wasn't about the past anymore, nor was it about his father's expectations. This was about a life, a small, innocent creature that needed him now. He gently stroked the calf's head, feeling the warmth of its feverish skin. He knew what he had to do. The nearest veterinary clinic was a good hour's drive, and the calf was too weak to transport without immediate stabilization. He would need to bring it back to the ranch, find medicine, and try to nurse it back to health himself. This wasn't a choice. It was an imperative. The forgotten skills, the instincts of a rancher he thought he'd shed, began to resurface. He remembered his father, patiently tending to sick animals in the barn, his weathered hands surprisingly delicate. This struggling herd, this frail calf, offered Ethan a concrete reason to stay that transcended the vague obligation he'd felt before. It wasn't about repairing the fences for some abstract future buyer or cleaning the house out of respect for the dead. It was about immediate, tangible care, about saving a life, about honoring a silent trust passed down. He looked at Wrangler, then back at the calf. The overwhelming decay of the ranch still loomed, but suddenly the path forward seemed clearer, anchored not by regret, but by a renewed, vital purpose. He would rebuild, not just for his father's sake, but for the sake of these animals, for the future of this land, and perhaps for himself. The weight of the photograph, a tangible link to a fractured past, pressed heavily in Ethan's hand, yet the call of the ranch, specifically the struggling cattle, gradually pulled him back to the present. He needed to move, to act, to escape the suffocating grip of introspection, and the animals offered a compelling, immediate purpose. As days turned into weeks, the rhythm of physical labor became a meditative practice, mending fences, clearing brush, repairing the derelict barn. Each task, though mundane, served to deepen his connection to the land and, unexpectedly, to the memories it held. The ranch, once a place of resentment, slowly began to reveal layers of his childhood that he had deliberately buried. One sweltering afternoon, while wrestling a rusted gate back onto its hinges, a vivid image flashed in his mind. His father, hands calloused and strong, patiently teaching a younger Ethan how to weld, the sparks flying like tiny stars against the twilight sky. He remembered the smell of burnt metal, the intense concentration in his father's eyes, and the quiet pride in his own chest when the join was finally solid. Another time, he discovered an old branding iron tucked away in a dusty corner of the tool shed. It was the one his father had used, the unique mark of their ranch, the Flying H. Holding the heavy, blackened metal, he remembered the annual branding season, a blur of dust, bellowing cattle, and the intoxicating scent of singed hair. He recalled his father's steady hand marking each calf, a ritual performed with unwavering dedication, a testament to the continuity of their lineage on this land. These weren't just random recollections. They were visceral, sensory experiences that brought his father's presence vividly back to him, not as a stern, unyielding figure, but as a man deeply entwined with the very soil beneath his boots. He unearthed a stack of water-stained ledger books in the bottom of an old desk drawer in the study, forgotten beneath layers of dust and discarded papers. Turning their brittle pages, Ethan saw meticulous records of cattle sales, feed costs, and yearly yields, all handwritten in his father's precise, if somewhat spidery, script. Each entry spoke volumes of unwavering dedication, a relentless battle against drought, market fluctuations, and the sheer unpredictability of ranch life. There were maps, hand-drawn and annotated, detailing irrigation lines long since crumbled, and crop rotations that spoke of a deep understanding of the land's temperament. In one of the ledgers, wedged between receipts for veterinary supplies, he found a pressed wildflower, brittle and faded, accompanied by a short note in his father's hand. "Found this by the creek after a good rain. Reminded me of your mother's eyes." It was a rare, tender glimpse into his father's inner world, a stark contrast to the stoic exterior Ethan had always known. These weren't merely documents. They were silent testaments to a life lived with profound purpose, a singular commitment to the ranch that transcended financial gain or easy living. The contrast between his father's relentless perseverance, etched into every line of those ledgers and every calloused tool, and Ethan's own impulsive flight years ago, created a sharp, almost unbearable emotional pang. His father had endured, had fought, had loved this land with a fierce, quiet devotion. Ethan had simply abandoned it, and him. The guilt, a familiar shadow, now had new contours, sharpened by the tangible evidence of his father's unwavering commitment. He hadn't just left a place. He had left a legacy, a dream, a man who, despite his perceived sternness, clearly harbored a deep, enduring affection for his family and his home. The realization wasn't merely intellectual. It was a deep, aching sensation in his chest, a profound sense of having failed not just himself, but a heritage that demanded respect and continuance. He felt a desperate need to honor that legacy, to make amends for his long absence, not just for his father's memory, but for the very soul of the ranch itself. The truth of his father's unwavering commitment, now so painfully evident, amplified Ethan's awareness of the surrounding community. He felt their eyes upon him, not overtly staring, but a subtle undercurrent of observation whenever he rode into town for supplies, or when a dust cloud on the horizon signaled a passing vehicle on the seldom-used county road. There was a quiet judgment in the air, a collective memory held by these hardened plains dwellers who remembered the Hale Ranch in its prime, and then watched its slow, inevitable decline after the youngest son had packed his bags and disappeared. He could almost hear the unspoken questions in their averted gazes, the wondering if he was truly back, or just passing through, another ghost haunting the familiar landscape. It was a weight, this community gaze, heavier than any physical task he had undertaken so far. He perceived the unspoken expectations, a silent pressure that settled over him like the evening dust. His father, despite his quiet nature, had been a pillar of this small, scattered community, a man to be relied upon, a rancher whose word was his bond, whose cattle always looked healthy, whose fences were always mended. There was a legacy there, a reputation built over decades of sweat and integrity, and Ethan knew they expected him to uphold it, or at least not disgrace it further. The ranch was more than just land and livestock. It was a symbol, a part of the local tapestry, and its health reflected, in a way, the health of their shared existence. The dilapidated state of the Flying H was a visible scar on that tapestry, and Ethan, by his mere presence, now carried the heavy burden of restoring not just the structures, but the pride that had once defined it. This implicit pressure, combined with the pressing realities of the ranch, manifested itself in a tangible test of his resolve. One sweltering afternoon, while attempting to re-establish a water line to a far pasture, the aged pump at the main well coughed, sputtered, and died with a final metallic groan. The silence that followed was deafening, amplified by the sudden cessation of the life-giving flow. Without water, the small herd he was so painstakingly nurturing would be in serious trouble, and his progress on the fences would mean nothing. This wasn't a problem he could solve with a wrench and a stubborn will. This required expertise, parts he didn't possess, and likely an interaction with the very community whose unspoken scrutiny he felt so acutely. He rode into town on Ace, the horses' hooves clattering a rhythm of reluctant necessity on the main street. The general store, the only hub of activity, seemed to amplify the quiet hum of unspoken judgment. Inside, Old Man Peterson, his face a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles, looked up from behind the counter, his eyes sharp and knowing. Ethan explained the pump situation, his voice betraying a hint of frustration he didn't intend. Peterson listened, nodding slowly, then drew a weathered finger across a dusty ledger. "Had Old Man Hale's pump running like a top for 40 years, that one," he rumbled, his gaze lingering on Ethan's face. "Reckon you'll need Jedediah. He still knows his way around those old engines." The suggestion, while helpful, felt like a veiled reminder of his father's competence and his own relative inexperience. It forced Ethan to swallow his pride, to admit a need for help, and to engage directly with the watchful eyes of the community. This wasn't just about a broken pump. It was about acknowledging his place within a network he had long abandoned, confronting the lingering shadows of his past choices head-on. The subtle observations from the local community, their quiet judgment or curiosity, had always been a weight on Ethan's shoulders, a constant, unspoken pressure. He felt the eyes on him as he drove into town for supplies, saw the quick, assessing glances over coffee at the diner. He knew they remembered him, the boy who'd left, and now the man who'd returned to a ranch that had fallen into disrepair. He perceived the unspoken weight of his father's reputation, a man who had weathered every storm, literally and figuratively, and the community's hopes for the ranch, for him, to somehow restore what was lost. His father, a man of few words but immense presence, had been a pillar of this community, and Ethan felt the burden of that legacy. A test of resolve arose unexpectedly when the ancient well pump, a contraption of rusted iron and creaking gears, finally gave up the ghost. One morning, the familiar gurgle of water was replaced by a strained metallic wheeze, then silence. The cattle, already parched from the dry spell, milled restlessly, their lowing a mournful chorus. It was a problem Ethan knew he couldn't tackle alone. He'd tried for hours, wrenching at seized bolts and cursing the stubborn mechanism, but it was beyond his limited mechanical expertise. The nearest well repair service was days out, and the cattle couldn't wait. This immediate, pressing need forced Ethan to confront his stubborn independence, to break through the wall of self-reliance he had meticulously built around himself. He had to ask for help. It was Jedediah, the neighbor who had offered that brief, cautious greeting weeks ago, who appeared on the horizon, his beat-up pickup kicking up a plume of dust. Jedediah, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-creased wrinkles and kind eyes, pulled up to the well, surveying the scene with a practiced gaze. Without a word, he retrieved a weathered toolbox from his truck bed. "Heard your pump went out, Ethan," Jedediah drawled, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Figured you might be needing a hand." Ethan, swallowing his pride, simply nodded, a tight knot in his stomach beginning to loosen. Jedediah didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. He offered practical advice and assistance, a silent understanding passing between them. Working side by side under the relentless sun, the rhythmic clang of wrenches against metal punctuated by Jedediah's succinct instructions, felt surprisingly natural. Ethan found himself following orders, handing tools, and learning the intricacies of the old pump's mechanics. Jedediah explained the quirks of the aquifer, the telltale signs of a failing seal, the best way to coax life back into ancient machinery. Their conversation was sparse, punctuated by grunts of effort and the occasional shared chuckle over a particularly stubborn bolt. Jedediah spoke of his own struggles with equipment, the unpredictable nature of the land, and the quiet resilience required to make a life out here. He didn't pry, didn't offer unsolicited counsel about Ethan's past, but his presence was a steadying force. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the pump sputtered, then coughed, and finally, with a triumphant gush, water surged forth, clear and cold, filling the trough. The cattle rushed forward, their thirst a testament to the urgency of the repair. Ethan stood back, watching the water flow, a profound sense of relief washing over him. He looked at Jedediah, whose face was streaked with grease and sweat, but held a quiet satisfaction. "Thanks, Jed," Ethan said, the words feeling inadequate but heartfelt. Jedediah just nodded, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "That's what neighbors are for, son." In that moment, a glimmer of hope sparked within Ethan. This interaction, this shared labor, this simple act of kindness, made him realize he wasn't entirely alone in this arduous endeavor. The isolation that had been his constant companion since his return began to recede, replaced by the faint, comforting warmth of connection. The ranch, and perhaps his own future, felt a little less daunting. The weight of those ledgers, those faded maps, and especially that pressed wildflower, settled heavily in Ethan's chest, a constant reminder of the depth of his father's commitment. He knew that the ranch held more such buried treasures, more fragments of a life he had only partially understood. Driven by this newfound understanding, a quiet urgency began to guide his steps. One sweltering afternoon, while attempting to clear a particularly stubborn patch of tangled brush near the far boundaries of the property, a section his father had always referred to vaguely as the old spring run, Ethan stumbled upon something unexpected. Hidden beneath years of fallen leaves and interwoven vines was a low, crumbling stone wall, barely discernible from the surrounding terrain. Curiosity piqued, he spent the rest of the day meticulously clearing away the overgrowth, his hands raw, his body aching, but a strange sense of anticipation buoying him. As the wall slowly revealed itself, he realized it wasn't just a random boundary. It enclosed a small, almost secret garden, now wild and overgrown, but clearly once tended with meticulous care. In the center, half buried and tilting precariously, stood a simple, unadorned wooden bench. Beneath it, etched into a weathered stone, were two sets of initials, H.H. and E.H., his father's and his mother's. This was her garden, the place his father had mentioned only in hushed, reverent tones, a sanctuary he had maintained even after her passing, a sacred space known only to them. He knelt, tracing the faded letters with a trembling finger, a sudden, profound realization washing over him. This wasn't merely a garden. It was a physical manifestation of his father's enduring love, a living memorial to the heart of their family. He remembered fleeting glimpses of his father sitting here alone in the evenings, silhouetted against the setting sun, a quiet sentinel guarding cherished memories. Ethan had always dismissed it then as just another one of his father's peculiar habits, another inscrutable action of a man he found difficult to connect with. Now, the full weight of those solitary hours descended upon him. His father hadn't just been running a ranch, he had been living a life steeped in quiet devotion, nurturing not only the land, but the memory of a love that defined him. The meticulous care evident in the few surviving rose bushes, now choked by weeds, but still bravely attempting to blossom, spoke volumes about a man who poured his soul into everything he touched. This was not just a place of remembrance for his mother. It was a testament to his father's own capacity for deep, unwavering affection, a side of him Ethan had rarely seen, or perhaps had been too young and too self-absorbed to appreciate. A powerful wave of empathy, sharp and almost painful, washed over Ethan. It was as if he could finally see his father, not through the narrow lens of adolescent rebellion, or adult resentment, but as a complete man, full of love, loss, and an incredible resilience. The dreams this land represented weren't solely about cattle and acreage. They were about family, continuity, and an unbreakable bond with a place. This neglected garden, this quiet corner of the ranch, became a focal point for all his complex emotions. It shifted his entire perspective on his father's life, transforming him from a stern patriarch into a deeply feeling individual who carried his grief with dignity and expressed his love through steadfast actions rather than effusive words. For the first time, Ethan understood the true depth of his father's connection to this land and the dreams it represented, not just for prosperity, but for profound personal meaning. He felt as though a missing piece of a lifelong puzzle had finally clicked into place. The old garden, newly reclaimed from the relentless clutches of nature, served as a stark, beautiful metaphor for the rest of the ranch. Fences, once sagging and splintered, now stood straight and strong, their fresh posts gleaming in the morning sun. The fields, where wild prairie grass had threatened to swallow everything, had been meticulously cut, revealing the rich, dark soil beneath, patiently awaiting new seeds. The barn, a skeletal ruin when Ethan first arrived, boasted a new roof, its weathered wood repaired, its doors rehung, a testament to weeks of back-breaking labor. The main house, though still holding its share of ghosts, no longer seemed on the verge of collapse. Its windows gleamed, its porch swept clean. A significant portion of the ranch, once a monument to decay, had been painstakingly restored by Ethan's own calloused hands. Yet, despite the tangible progress, the physical restoration felt strangely incomplete, a hollow victory. The emotional scars, the deeply etched lines of regret and unspoken words, remained. He stood one evening by the newly mended fence line, watching the last vestiges of twilight fade from the vast Wyoming sky. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine. His horse, Shadow, grazed peacefully nearby, a comforting presence. For the first time since his return, the exhaustion in his bones wasn't just physical. It was a profound weariness of the soul. He had rebuilt the ranch, piece by painstaking piece, but in doing so, he had merely patched over the deeper wounds within himself. The quiet solitude that had once been a refuge now felt like a prison. He had avoided confronting the true nature of his prolonged absence, the raw, aching guilt that festered beneath his determined exterior. He had thrown himself into work, hoping the sheer physicality of it would drown out the persistent whispers of his conscience, the phantom echoes of his father's disappointment. This was the turning point. The physical battle was largely won, but the true war, the one against his own past, was just beginning. It was a profound internal reflection, acknowledging the mistakes he had made, the pain he had caused, not just to his father, but to himself. He realized that simply fixing the ranch wasn't enough to heal the chasm between them. The garden had shown him his father's heart, but it had also forced him to confront the hardness in his own. He remembered the arguments, the slamming doors, the defiant, self-righteous anger of youth that now seemed so foolish, so utterly destructive. He had left, convinced he was escaping a life he didn't want, only to discover that he had, in fact, been running from himself and the love, however imperfectly expressed, that had always been there. The catalyst for change came with the full recognition that his father could never offer him forgiveness in person. That opportunity was forever lost. But reconciliation, true reconciliation, was still within his grasp. Not with a living man, but with the memory, the legacy, the spirit of his father. He couldn't undo the past, but he could reshape his relationship with it. He needed to actively seek reconciliation, not just with the land that had been his father's lifeblood, but with his own history, his own heart. The ranch was more than just land and cattle. It was a testament to his father's enduring spirit, and by honoring it, by truly understanding its depth, Ethan could finally find a path towards his own redemption. This was a decision born not of obligation, but of a deep, unshakable need for peace. The sun dipped lower, casting long, melancholic shadows across the revitalized garden. Ethan, feeling a profound connection to this sacred space, carefully cleared the remaining weeds from around the old wooden bench. He then retrieved a small, intricately carved wooden bird from his saddlebag, an item he'd carried with him for years, a forgotten gift from his father on his 5th birthday. He placed it gently on the center of the bench, a solitary sentinel amongst the struggling rose bushes. This wasn't merely an act of tidying, it was a silent apology. A whispered promise to honor the love that had bloomed here. He imagined his parents, young and hopeful, sitting together on this very bench, dreams of a future etched into the Wyoming dust. It was a tangible link, a small bridge across the chasm of years and unspoken words. The simple gesture brought an unexpected swell of peace, a quiet acceptance of the past he had so long avoided. Later that evening, as the stars began to pinprick the vast canvas of the sky, Ethan found himself sitting on his porch, the familiar creak of the wood a comforting rhythm. He saw the faint glow of a lantern approaching through the darkness, recognizing the silhouette of Old Man Hemlock. The neighbor, a man of few words and profound wisdom, settled onto the step below Ethan's. For a long while, they sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the chirping crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Then Ethan, driven by a newfound courage born from the day's revelations, spoke. "My father, he spent a lot of time in that garden, didn't he?" Old Man Hemlock nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "He did. After your mother passed, it became his sanctuary. Said it was the only place he felt truly close to her." His voice was raspy, laced with years of hard living and quiet observation. "He missed her something fierce, Ethan. Never stopped." Ethan swallowed, the words catching in his throat. He felt the sting of tears, not of sorrow this time, but of understanding. I left him alone, didn't I? When he needed me most." The confession, raw and unvarnished, hung in the night air. It was the first time he had ever voiced that particular regret, the deep-seated guilt that had simmered beneath his gruff exterior for decades. The weight of it, once a crushing burden, now felt strangely lighter, simply by being spoken aloud. He looked at the old man, seeking something, anything, to alleviate the ache. Old Man Hemlock turned, his weathered face softened by the dim light. His eyes, though aged, held a clear, empathetic gaze. "A young man's got a right to find his own way, Ethan. Your father, he understood that. It didn't mean he didn't hurt, but he understood. He always talked about you, you know? Proud of the man you were becoming, even if he didn't always show it the way you might have wanted." He paused, letting the words sink in. "He just wanted what was best for you, son. Always." The quiet understanding in the old man's voice was a balm to Ethan's soul. It wasn't absolution, not entirely, but it was a beginning. It was the acknowledgement he desperately needed, a gentle nudge towards self-forgiveness. He felt a knot in his chest begin to unravel, a lifetime of resentment and misunderstanding, slowly giving way to a nascent sense of peace. The neighbor's words, simple yet profound, offered a perspective Ethan had been incapable of grasping until now. He realized that perhaps his father's stoicism wasn't a lack of love, but simply his way of coping, his way of protecting his son from his own profound grief. The old man's quiet presence, his unspoken empathy, had opened a door Ethan hadn't even realized was locked. He was finally beginning to receive the forgiveness and understanding he hadn't known he so desperately craved, not just from the community, but from within himself. The profound emotional upheaval from discovering his mother's garden and understanding his father's quiet devotion left Ethan feeling raw and exposed. Through it all, a constant presence, a steady anchor in his turbulent emotional sea, was his horse, Comanche. The animal, ancient and wise in its own right, seemed to sense the shifts within Ethan. Comanche would nuzzle his hand gently as Ethan sat on the newly cleared bench in the garden, his gaze lost in thought. There was a quiet understanding in those moments, a non-verbal communication that transcended human complexities. Riding each morning, the rhythm of Comanche's hooves on the dusty trails provided a meditative backdrop to Ethan's processing. He would lean into the familiar sway, feeling the powerful muscles beneath him, the warmth of the horse's body, a comforting presence against his leg. Comanche never judged, never questioned. He simply was. A steadfast companion through the years of Ethan's self-imposed exile, and now through this arduous journey of rediscovery. Ethan had often taken Comanche's loyalty for granted, a given in a world that felt otherwise unreliable. But now, in the stillness of the Wyoming mornings, he began to truly appreciate the depth of that bond. It was a connection forged not through words, but through shared experiences, shared hardships, and countless miles ridden together under silent, watchful skies. There were times Ethan would simply dismount in a quiet meadow, letting Comanche graze while he sat nearby, watching the horse. The way Comanche moved, the flick of an ear, the soft sigh as it contentedly munched on grass. Each small action spoke volumes. It reminded Ethan of a simpler existence, a purity of intention that he felt he had long lost. Comanche's unwavering presence was a stark contrast to the fleeting, often superficial relationships Ethan had cultivated during his years away. The horse demanded nothing but care and respect, offering in return a boundless fidelity that shamed Ethan with its sincerity. One afternoon, while mending a section of fence near the far pasture, Ethan felt a sudden sharp pain in his hand as a stray barb tore into his flesh. He flinched, stifling a curse, and looked up to find Comanche standing beside him, nudging his shoulder gently with its head. There was a soft whicker, a sound of almost human concern. Ethan, usually stoic, found himself leaning into the horse's warm neck, burying his face in its coarse mane. A quiet sob escaped him, the first he had allowed himself since his return, since his father's passing. Comanche remained still, a silent, comforting pillar of strength, absorbing the tremor of Ethan's grief. This non-verbal bonding became a crucial part of Ethan's healing. He found himself talking to Comanche more, not expecting answers, but needing to vocalize the swirling thoughts in his mind. He spoke of his father, of his regrets, of the overwhelming sense of responsibility for the ranch. Comanche would listen with attentive ears, occasionally shifting its weight or blowing softly through its nostrils, as if acknowledging every word. In these private conversations, Ethan began to unravel the knots of guilt and resentment that had tightened around his heart for so long. Comanche, in its innocence and unwavering loyalty, became a mirror. The horse's steadfastness prompted Ethan to reflect on his own relationships, particularly the broken promises and unfulfilled expectations that had plagued his past. He saw how easily he had abandoned his own responsibilities, how quickly he had ridden away from difficult truths. Comanche's dependable nature highlighted Ethan's own inconsistencies, pushing him gently towards a more honest and accountable version of himself. The horse was not merely a mode of transport or a companion. It was a silent teacher, guiding Ethan back towards the core values of commitment and genuine connection, reminding him that true allegiance, whether to a place or a person, was a bond that deserved to be cherished and protected. The simple, profound connection with his horse underscored a growing capacity for care and a renewed understanding of true companionship. The quiet, steadfast healing Ethan experienced with Comanche, combined with his diligent work on the ranch, began to create a subtle but undeniable ripple effect throughout the small, tightly knit community. Initially, the townsfolk had observed Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and cautious judgment, memories of his abrupt departure still lingering like dust motes in the dry Wyoming air. They had seen the dilapidated state of the Hale Ranch, a visible symbol of neglect and broken ties, and likely assumed Ethan's return was a temporary, perhaps even ill-fated endeavor. Yet as weeks turned into months, the signs of his tireless effort became impossible to ignore. Fences that had long sagged were now taut and straight. Fields once choked with weeds showed nascent signs of cultivation, and the ranch house, though still rough, no longer exuded the same air of desolate abandonment. The first palpable shift in the community's perception came not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent acts. One sweltering afternoon, Ethan, having finally repaired the notoriously stubborn community well pump that served several smaller homesteads, found himself surrounded by a few grateful neighbors. He hadn't sought their praise, simply understood the necessity of clean water during a particularly dry spell. Their quiet nods of thanks, the genuine smiles, and the offer of a cool drink felt different from the initial wary greetings. It wasn't just about the pump, it was about Ethan showing up, contributing, becoming a thread in the communal tapestry again. He began re-establishing ties more concretely. The annual summer picnic, a tradition his father had always championed, was approaching. Ethan, remembering how much it had meant to his father, offered to help organize it, something he would never have considered in his previous life. He found himself discussing logistics with old Mrs. Henderson, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, and sharing stories with young Billy, who remembered Ethan as a distant, almost mythical figure from his father's tales. These interactions, initially awkward, gradually loosened, becoming more natural, more reciprocal. He listened to their concerns about the upcoming winter, offered insights from his own burgeoning experience with the herd, and even cracked a few dry jokes, a part of himself, he thought, long buried. Word spread, as it always does in small towns. People noticed the way he handled his cattle, the respect he showed the land, and the quiet dignity with which he carried himself, He was no longer just the prodigal son who ran off, but Ethan Hale, the man who was working tirelessly to restore his family's legacy. When a wildfire threatened a neighboring pasture, Ethan was among the first to respond, riding in with Comanche, his face smudged with soot, working shoulder to shoulder with men he had once only vaguely known. He didn't seek recognition. He simply did what needed to be done. This active participation, this quiet commitment to the well-being of his neighbors and the land, began to reshape his identity in the eyes of the community, and more importantly, in his own. He started to feel less like a temporary guest, an outsider merely passing through, and more like a vital part of the fabric of this place again. The ranch was no longer just a burden or a monument to his father's memory. It was becoming his home once more. He found a quiet satisfaction in the mundane rhythms of ranch life, in the shared labor, and in the unspoken camaraderie that grew from facing common challenges. The Wyoming wind still carried echoes of the past, but now it also whispered promises of a future, one where Ethan stood firmly rooted, an integral part of the land and its people. Years had passed since Ethan had last sifted through his father's personal effects, a task he'd largely avoided, the emotional weight too heavy to bear. Now, with a calmer heart and a clearer mind, he found himself in the dust-laden study, a room once bustling with his father's quiet industry. Sunlight streamed through a grimy window, illuminating motes dancing in the air and casting long shadows across the worn wooden desk. He opened a forgotten drawer, a place he'd never seen his father access, and beneath a stack of old ledger books and dried-up inkwells, he discovered a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was smooth with age, the pages within yellowed and fragile. This was not the ranch log, meticulously kept for business, but something far more personal. As Ethan carefully turned the brittle pages, his breath hitched. The familiar, strong handwriting of his father filled the journal, but the words were not about cattle prices or fence repairs. They were raw, honest reflections, dated entries spanning years, many from the period immediately following Ethan's abrupt departure from the ranch. His father wrote of his deep solitude, of the physical toll of maintaining the ranch alone. But overwhelmingly, he wrote of Ethan. Entry after entry spoke of a father's unyielding love, intertwined with a profound sorrow and confusion over his son's absence. One particular entry, dated just weeks after Ethan had left, described a desperate decision. The ranch was on the brink of financial collapse, not an uncommon tale in those lean years. Ethan had always believed his father was stubborn, unwilling to adapt. But the journal revealed a different truth. His father had quietly sold off a significant portion of his prized breeding stock, the very lineage he had painstakingly built for decades, to pay for Ethan's college tuition Ethan had ultimately abandoned. He hadn't told Ethan, fearing it would only add to the young man's perceived burden, fearing Ethan would reject the sacrifice. He had written, "A father's duty is to provide opportunity, even if that opportunity is unwelcomed. My boy deserves better than this dust and hardscrabble." The words struck Ethan with the force of a physical blow. He had always harbored the bitter belief that his father had been overly focused on the ranch, prioritizing it above their relationship, never truly understanding his son's aspirations beyond the cattle and pastures. Now, he saw the ultimate act of selflessness, a silent, profound sacrifice made out of an overwhelming, unspoken love. His father had sold his dreams to potentially fund Ethan's, and Ethan, in his youthful arrogance, had never even known. The perceived neglect was, in truth, an extreme form of protectiveness. Tears welled up, blurring the ancient script. Ethan's heart, which had carried the heavy weight of resentment and guilt for so long, felt as if it were finally cracking open, allowing a torrent of emotion to rush in. The misunderstanding that had fueled their estrangement, that chasm of silence between them, suddenly seemed tragically clear. His father hadn't been indifferent. He had loved Ethan with a fierce, quiet intensity, a love so deep he was willing to suffer in silence to ensure his son's potential. A profound internal reconciliation unfolded within Ethan. He didn't need his father to be physically present to forgive him, or more accurately, to forgive himself for misjudging such a good man. The anger, the bitterness, the long-held grievances against his father dissolved, replaced by a wave of overwhelming grief for what they had lost, for the words left unsaid, for the understanding that came too late. Yet, amidst the sorrow, there was also a nascent peace. He had found his father, not in the dirt and the wood, but in the pages of this hidden journal, in the raw truth of his own heart. The ranch, the land, the very dust that had separated them, now held the key to finally bringing them together in spirit, forever. The ranch was thriving again, a verdant testament to Ethan's relentless hard work and his profoundly renewed spirit. He stood on the porch, the old wood now solid beneath his boots, gazing out at fields lush with new growth, fences neatly mended, and the cattle fat and content. The weathered barn, once a skeletal ruin, now boasted a fresh coat of paint and sturdy timbers, its doors creaking open to reveal well-tended stalls. The house, too, reflected the transformation, no longer a tomb of regret, but a home filled with the quiet hum of purpose. Ethan had found a deep, abiding peace with his past. The bitterness that had once gnawed at his soul had receded, replaced by a profound understanding forged in the crucible of labor and self-reflection. The revelation of his father's true feelings, unveiled in that dusty, forgotten ledger, had been the final, crucial stone in laying his emotional foundations anew. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about realization, an acceptance of the complex tapestry of love and misunderstanding that had defined their relationship. He understood now that his father's perceived harshness had often been a desperate attempt to protect, to prepare, to instill a resilience he thought Ethan lacked. Ethan walked slowly towards the freshly tilled garden, a project he had begun only weeks ago, but which was already showing promising sprouts. He bent down, running a calloused hand over the dark, rich soil. This wasn't merely about planting seeds. It was about nurturing life, about commitment to the future. He saw his hands, strong and capable, no longer the hands of a man fleeing his responsibilities, but of one firmly rooted in them. The ranch was no longer a symbol of his father's unfulfilled dream or his own guilt-ridden escape. It was a living, breathing entity, a legacy he was proud to carry forward, not as a burden, but as a privilege. Comanche ambled over, nudging his arm with a soft muzzle. Ethan stroked the horse's mane, the familiar warmth, a constant comfort. Their bond, forged in the silent language of mutual respect and companionship, had been a crucial anchor during his most turbulent emotional storms. Comanche had witnessed his grief, his anger, his quiet moments of despair, and his slow, steady climb back to himself. The horse was a silent confidant, a loyal friend who asked for nothing but offered everything. He looked out across the land, the setting sun painting the Wyoming sky in hues of orange and purple. The vastness no longer felt intimidating or isolating. It felt expansive, full of possibility. The isolation he had once craved, then endured, had given way to a quiet sense of belonging. He had reconnected with the community, found camaraderie in shared work, and discovered that true strength lay not in solitary stoicism, but in the willingness to ask for and accept help. The scars remained, etched into the landscape and his soul, but they were no longer festering wounds. They were reminders of a journey, lessons learned, and fortitude gained. The ranch was more than just land and livestock. It was a promise to rebuild, to nurture, to honor the past without being enslaved by it. His father's legacy was not just the physical property, but the spirit of resilience, the deep connection to the land, and the unspoken love that had finally, gloriously, made itself known. Ethan felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years, a profound acceptance of his own story. He smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile, knowing that he was precisely where he was meant to be, embracing his roots and ready to face whatever the future held. If you were touched by Ethan's story,